To understand this time period of 1801 to 1808, you first need to understand who was the president at this time, and what kind of person was he. And that president was, obviously, you can tell from the picture above, that president was Thomas Jefferson. So first things first, we need to understand that Thomas Jefferson was a founding father. He did a lot of wonderful things for our country, but he did a lot of negative things too, such as have slaves and things like that. He was a Democratic Republican, so he believed in the strict interpretation of the Constitution. He believed that state rights should kind of be above a strong central government. The government shouldn't have as much power as it did during John Adams' presidency, and that was something that he was adamant about. And he really wanted to see this agricultural society filled with a lot of farmers and really just this independent, free farming country, which is really what he wanted to see come out of his presidency. He contributed a lot of important legislation, like the Kentucky Resolution that we talked about during John Adams' presidency, where he essentially nullified and didn't abide by legislation that he felt was unconstitutional. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is like the core of the United States, that said that, we are declaring independence from Britain. He created the University of Virginia, which set the standard for what colleges really look like today, and that was a huge innovation that he put out in the world. He brought the Louisiana Territory into our country, which essentially doubled the size of our country in 1803, so that was very important. But with the good comes the bad. So he also was a slave owner. He had the Monticello Plantation, which was 5,000 acres worth of farming land, where he had 130 slaves at any given time working on his land and generating him wealth. And he had, children by his slaves, but yet he didn't free more than 10 slaves during his life. So we see that he says that all men are created equal in this Declaration of Independence, but did he really practice what he preached? Because during his lifetime, he did own over 600 slaves. He barely freed any slaves during his lifetime. So what does this say about this man who ended up being our president? That was one of the most important key figures in the beginning of our country's history. So like any person during this time, we really have to place them in their time period. Yes, he did amazing things. Yes, he did awful things like own slaves. But overall, Thomas Jefferson did contribute a lot to this country. Whether he did dark things or not, he was a key figure in the construction of our new nation. The 12th Amendment of the United States, it's not one that we generally are, jumping up and down about or know a ton about, like we know about, things like the First Amendment, but it's definitely an important one. So when we look at the elections of 1796 and the election of 1800, there were these issues that, were a result of this flaw in the Constitution under Article 2, Section 1. So let's first talk about the election of 1800. So as you can see from the picture on the bottom, Burr and Jefferson tied in this election. We know that John Adams, had the least amount of electoral votes, so he was out. But you have these two men who tie in the election. And the way that the Constitution originally set up for elections to, happen was that the person who lost would essentially become the vice president to the winner. But since these two men were tied, this got really hairy and really tricky. It took 6 days and 36 ballots before it was finally decided that Jefferson would be the president and Burr would be the vice president. So the 12th Amendment really came about to solve these issues and make sure that this never happened again. Because this was just too much chaos. It was electoral chaos, because there was not a separate vote for president and vice president. So in cases like this, in cases like the election of 1796, they needed a system that worked better and was more efficient. So this 12th Amendment would basically make it so there were separate votes and separate ballots, two separate ballots for the president and the vice president. Because, when the Constitution was originally made, they really didn't know that there were going to be political parties. They didn't know that there were going to be issues that would cause ties like this. So this 12th Amendment basically came about to fix these issues and make sure there was two separate ballots, two separate votes for the president and the vice president. And this would essentially solve this problem and make sure that it never happened again, and it really never did. So Jefferson obviously was president for 2 terms, as we can see from, 1800 to 1808, and he had 2 very contrasting different terms. So his first term went beautifully. His second term, not so much. It was a little rockier, but first let's talk about this term. So, like the PowerPoint says, it was definitely a success. When he had his inaugural address, he said, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. And he basically was saying, we are all Americans. We're going to work together to, boost this economy, to be this United States that I know that we can be. And it really panned out, and you can see that in his legislation and a lot of the decisions that he made. So, we know that Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. He believed in smaller government power, and that's definitely something that he followed through with. He reduced the size of the government. He lowered taxes drastically, getting rid of things like the whiskey tax, which was definitely very important because that's the exact opposite of what people like John Adams did. He shrunk the military, which is very crazy to think about. Because you have, other presidents putting so much emphasis on the military in the United States. He wanted this agricultural economy, and this is the beauty of studying history, because you see people like John Adams, who was right before him, who really put this emphasis on industrialization and business and things like that. And he had this northern viewpoint, this federalist viewpoint of, industrialization and moving forward. Whereas you have Jefferson, who really wanted independent, free farmers to focus on their land on the agricultural side of the country and basically have this country full of farmers. And this is going to feed into a lot of the decisions that he makes during his presidency, like the Louisiana Purchase. And we're definitely going to go into that more because it's the highlight of his entire presidency, I think. But at the end of the day, there needed to be more land for the growing population of farmers that he wanted. So they really looked into this other land that they could purchase that's in that Louisiana territory that used to belong to Spain. So we're going to see that Louisiana Purchase be a huge, very successful part of his first term. He also paid off some of the national debt. A lot of that he took from the military and put into, reducing that debt. And he got rid of legislation that came from the Federalist Party, John Adams, to be specific, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which we know were really unpopular with a lot of people in the United States. So if you look at this entire list of things that he did during his first term, it definitely worked out for him. He was definitely a popular guy after his first term because of all these great things he did, which undoubtedly helped him win that second election with a landslide. So Marbury versus Madison was undoubtedly one of the most Supreme Court cases in the history of the United States. So this court case really started out of something so insignificant as a man wanting a job and taking this to the court because he couldn't get the job he wanted. And it really snowballed into the fact that this case showed the United States truly what the power of the Supreme Court and the judicial branch of the United States really does. So let me break this down for you guys. First and foremost, we need to kind of understand where this case even came out of. So this Marbury versus Madison court case came out of the fact that John Adams made this decision on his way out of his presidency to appoint a bunch of Federalist judges to the courts. But in this process of doing this, he had to leave the White House and couldn't enforce that all these judges that he appointed would get their commissions. In other words, they needed this paper document that really set it in stone that they had this job to be these judges. So when Thomas Jefferson came into the White House and he became president, he asked his Secretary of State, James Madison, to get in the way of these judges getting these commissions to make it so they couldn't fulfill these jobs. And one of these judges was absolutely furious at this. His name was William Marbury, and he takes this to the Supreme Court, in this case, Marbury versus Madison, basically saying that, he wants his commission, he wants the job that he got from John Adams, and he wants it to be written in stone. And this is where this entire thing is born out of. And you now see Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall is the one that's going to rule on this case, and he rules two very important things. The first thing that he rules is that Marbury could get the job and that he could get his commission. So that was definitely important. But then more importantly, he understands and he recognizes the fact that the Supreme Court really doesn't have the constitutional right to rule on this. So out of this case, he now is going to give the Supreme Court the power to rule in these cases. He's going to give the power of judicial review to the Supreme Court and the judicial branch of the United States. And this essentially would mean that, if there's a conflict between Congress and the power of the Constitution, the power of the Constitution would always be the supreme law of the land. It would always be, the end all be all decision. Whatever the Constitution said would be the most important thing. So this Marbury versus Madison, started because a man was angry and wanted a job, but it really ended up defining the role of the Supreme Court and really letting the United States know what that judicial branch of government was really all about. When we hear the word duel, we think of, crazy fictional shows like Game of Thrones, because it seems like something so crazy and so ridiculous that, we wouldn't consider happening in the political sphere of 19th century United States history, but it is something that happened, and it's undoubtedly the most famous duel in American history that occurred between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. So first, let's talk about the reasons why this even happened in the first place. So we're seeing a really famous founding father, Alexander Hamilton, who distrusts another political figure who's pretty popular during this time, which is Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr at this time is born into a really wealthy family. He's very educated, and he ends up wanting to be the governor of New York, and he ends up running against Thomas Jefferson and even tying with him in electoral votes for the election of 1800. But if you look at both of these situations where Aaron Burr is trying to excel and, gain all this political experience and become president and governor, Alexander Hamilton is behind his losses 100%. So you see that he's a big reason why he doesn't become governor in New York. And you're seeing that he switches his vote to Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800, so Aaron Burr ends up losing the election. So there's already this animosity and this anger that Burr has towards Hamilton. But then on top of it, you're going to see that Alexander Hamilton says a lot of negative things and spreads a lot of rumors during this time that ruin Aaron Burr's reputation. So at this point, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton's feud is really at this boiling point. And in this time period, the way to solve this outside of the law would be to duel. So this was illegal during this time to duel, but it was kind of an accepted tradition that people really turned a blind eye to during this time. So at the end of the day, on July 11th, 1804, these two very famous men meet in Weehawken, New Jersey, and they end up dueling. But the catch about this is Alexander Hamilton didn't really think that this was going to be a situation where someone died. You're going to see that he kind of shoots away, apparently, whereas Aaron Burr shoots him in the abdomen, shoots Alexander Hamilton in the abdomen. And although Alexander Hamilton doesn't die that day, he ends up going back to his house, and with people that love him around him, he ends up dying that next day. And this is a huge deal, because we know that Alexander Hamilton, he's one of the central founding fathers. He's at the center of a lot of the things that made our country what it is today. For instance, he wrote the Constitution, which we've spent a large amount of time talking about because it's such an influential document. So for someone like this to be murdered at the hands of Aaron Burr, we can see that it completely destroys Aaron Burr's reputation. He's wanted for murder, and although he doesn't go to jail for murder, he's practically in jail for the rest of his life on the basis that, he loses the opportunity to be the vice president in Thomas Jefferson's second term, and he's really just not looked at as a good guy. He's looked at as a murderer for the entirety of his life, and he's unable to really excel in the political sphere and do good things after this, because at the end of the day, he was the man who killed Alexander Hamilton. So the Louisiana Purchase was such a huge, significant win for Thomas Jefferson's first term as president that it's really hard for me to even explain to you how huge this whole thing was, this transaction between, the United States and France. But I'm definitely going to try and show you when we look at this picture down here. So as you can see in the picture down here, if you look at the right side of the country with all of these divided states, this is what the United States looked like before 1803. And then you look to the middle of this, and where you see the orangey area that says Louisiana Purchase. And this is what Thomas Jefferson added to the United States when he made this Louisiana Purchase with France. So it's definitely a huge deal. It essentially doubled the size of our country. It added about 14 states to the United States, and it added a lot of trade, commerce. It boosted the economy a lot and allowed these people to have more land and to kind of spread out. And it really started this westward expansion that would make the country the size that it is today. So first, let's dive into the reasons why this even came about. So at this time, we know that Thomas Jefferson really wanted this agricultural economy and society. And in order for him to, fulfill this, people needed land so they could, be these free, independent farmers that Thomas Jefferson wanted them to be. So there needed to be more land added to the United States. And on top of that, Thomas Jefferson wanted this land that was near the Mississippi River, particularly this New Orleans area, because New Orleans was a port city, and by adding this area around New Orleans, there would be such an increase in trade and commerce with other places around the world. So that was really the reason that Thomas Jefferson was even looking into the southern part of this Louisiana territory. So in order to do this, he wanted to begin this negotiation with France. So he sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to negotiate in Paris and ask for this southern piece of this Louisiana territory for around $10 million. But to his surprise, and this was an amazing thing, at this point in time, Napoleon was getting to the point where he had to wrap his head around the fact that he couldn't keep this land anymore. He had to sell his territory in Northern America because he had too much going on and he needed the money. So first and foremost, there was a Haitian revolution going on. So a freed slave in Haiti decided that they were going to start a slave rebellion, and this is one of these rare instances in history where a slave rebellion was successful, and this was bankrupting Napoleon and France. So that was a reason that he needed to sell this territory and get money. And also on top of it, Napoleon had all of these conflicts and military battles going on throughout Europe that he really needed to fund. So he thought that by getting rid of this Louisiana territory and giving it to the United States for money, this would help resolve some of his problems and issues with debt. So to the United States' shock and surprise, he was willing to give the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. And just to put this into perspective for all of you, this is 800,000 square miles of land, essentially under a nickel for 1 acre. So I live on less than 1 acre of land, and that's like me and my family buying this land for under a nickel. So that is an insane amount of land for an insanely low price. So this is essentially a huge win. I mean, this is taking the United States and amplifying it and making it so much bigger and so much better. But in order to do this, Thomas Jefferson needed to go against his Democratic Republican ideas, because we know that Thomas Jefferson really believed in this strict interpretation of the Constitution. However, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that a president can add this much land or any land at all to the country. But Thomas Jefferson argued that, presidents are allowed to make foreign treaties and things like that with other countries, so the Louisiana Purchase fell under this category. And although that can be argued, and most people would say, no, this was a land deal, Thomas Jefferson went against his ideas, and Congress allowed it, and Thomas Jefferson allowed this Louisiana Purchase to go through, because if you look at it, it was a huge deal, and it really did benefit our country and make it what it is today. So we look at this and we say, wow, this is amazing. What a great addition to the country. But it did come with its drawbacks. First and foremost, slavery is still a thing in the United States. And you're seeing a lot of the North is more industrial, and they're not really believing that slavery should be around anymore. I mean, you're going to see slavery still prevalent up there for a while, but all in all, you're going to see a lot of the northern states start to gradually abolish slavery. And you're going to see the southern states still really depending on the labor of slaves. So people have this argument going on in the United States about what the Louisiana territory is going to look like when it becomes part of the United States. So in other words, what are they going to do? Are they going to have slaves? Are they going to be free states? Are they going to mix? Is this going to be an issue? So the issue of slavery in that territory is definitely something that they worry about. And also, there are indigenous people who live there. They lived there while it was Spanish territory. They lived there while it was French territory in 1801. And now when it gets shifted hands over to the United States and to Jefferson, people are wondering, what are we going to do about the Native Americans who live on that land? And this is going to become an issue that really presses on throughout the presidency of Thomas Jefferson and even past that. So although this added a ton of land and it essentially doubled the size of the United States, really helped the economy, there definitely is issues that came with it as well. The Corps of Discovery is really just a fancy term for the Lewis and Clark expeditions that happened after the Louisiana Purchase. So we know that in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was made, and now Thomas Jefferson brought in this huge chunk of land to the United States, and no one really knows what the heck is on this land. So Thomas Jefferson sends Meriwether Lewis to be the captain of this voyage, and Lewis brings in his friend William Clark, and they decide that together they're going to go on this 2-year, 4-month journey into this uncharted land, and they need to accomplish 3 things while they're there. And these aren't just little tasks. These are huge tasks that Thomas Jefferson is giving to these men and trusting them with. The first one is to discover the Northwest Passage. And the Northwest Passage is really the sea route between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. So this is definitely a really difficult task and something really difficult to ask of somebody. Also, Jefferson wants to know what animals are there, what plants are there that we don't know about, and I want to know the geographical points and things that we should know that are over there. So what does the land look like? Map that out for me. Also, Thomas Jefferson wants to give them the task of making friendships and having positive, relationships with the Native American tribes who live on that land. Because, if you have a tough relationship with the people, the indigenous people who are living there, it could really get tricky bringing that land into the United States. So Lewis and Clark go on to this land, and they really accomplished 2 out of these 3 things, and that's a big deal. So they did not discover the Northwest Passage, but they did document over 100 new animal species. You have 176 new plant species that are being discovered. They produced over 140 maps of this land, and they really made these positive relationships with Native Americans. Realistically, Lewis and Clark wouldn't have successfully made this journey if they didn't make friends with the Shoshone Native Americans and really run into people like really famous indigenous peoples that you definitely have heard the names of, such as Sacagawea, because these people know the land. They live on the land. They always have. So their decision to assist Lewis and Clark in the expedition really was the reason that it was so successful. So as you can see, this was a huge success, sending Lewis and Clark on this course of discovery. They came back with a lot of good, positive things to tell Thomas Jefferson, and this was really just the proof that this Louisiana Purchase was a great decision on Thomas Jefferson's end. So if you take a look at the 1804 election, you really don't want to be Charles Pinckney, because Charles Pinckney took the L, and he took it really hard in this election. You have Charles Pinckney, who is the Federalist in this election. He is the Federalist candidate. And you have Thomas Jefferson, who of course is a Democratic Republican. Thomas Jefferson is really a crowd favorite at this point. People love him. I mean, he brought the Louisiana Territory into the United States. He's making all the right decisions in his first term. So this election is really expected to kind of be a landslide victory for Thomas Jefferson, and that's exactly what it was. You have Jefferson with 162 electoral votes at the end of this election, and Charles Pinckney with only 14. This is huge. I mean, look at this gap. This, to this day, hundreds of years later, is still the most lopsided victory in American history. Only 2 states, Delaware and Connecticut, went to Charles Pinckney. And you see that in the 5th presidential election, you have Thomas Jefferson, who's going to win president for a second term, and George Clinton as his vice president. And I think it's really important to point out that during the first term of Thomas Jefferson, you're going to see Aaron Burr as his vice president. But due to the fact that he made that horrible decision to kill Alexander Hamilton in the duel, Thomas Jefferson, for good reason, wants to distance himself from Aaron Burr and now picks a new vice president. So at the end of this, it's really important to realize the Federalist Party is kind of fading out, as you can see with that huge loss from Charles Pinckney, and Democratic Republicans are in the spotlight. Thomas Jefferson has the hearts of Americans at this point, and he is going to go towards his second term as president. So I've talked about it a few times throughout this PowerPoint, but Thomas Jefferson's first term was a huge win for the United States. You see that he added the Louisiana Purchase territory, which was a huge deal, and he's doing a lot of things to really boost the economy, and he's making a lot of people happy. And you can see that in the way that he really, swept the floor with Charles Pinckney in the election. I mean, he won by a huge margin, which shows that people were very happy with the way he was running the country. But his second term is really not as, fun and dandy as his first term. He calls his second term a splendid misery because he's running into all these problems that he didn't have to deal with in his first presidency. But before we go into, the negatives of his second term, let's first talk about the positives, because there definitely was some. So first things first, and we just talked about this, Lewis and Clark returned from their journey throughout the Louisiana Territory, and they come back with nothing but good news, showing the United States and Thomas Jefferson that this decision to take this Louisiana Territory and pay $15 million for it was a great decision. So that's a plus, definitely a plus. And then you're seeing that there's this issue with the Barbary pirates between the United States and other European nations. So they're like the pirates of the Mediterranean Sea, and they are attacking United States commerce on on the seas. So you're seeing that trade, United States trade, is being heavily affected by the fact that these Barbary pirates are attacking United States ships and things like that. And finally, Thomas Jefferson really puts down this issue, and he takes care of it finally after so many years of this issue being like a consistent problem. So that's definitely a plus. So Lewis and Clark return with really good news, and he finally defeats the Barbary pirates and gets them to stop torturing American ships. But obviously, with every high point, there's a low point, and this second term has a lot of them. So he now has all of these struggles coming out of foreign affairs. So he's really not getting along with, Britain. He's having these issues with France. British ships are really torturing American ships, and you're seeing that in situations like Leopard versus Chesapeake, where, the British ship Leopard is now attacking the Chesapeake, firing at them, killing and injuring a lot of Americans because they're trying to find deserters, people who left the British Navy to go over to the United States. So that's becoming an issue, and his response to that situation is to pass the Embargo Act, which would essentially cut off trade and not allow the United States to trade with other nations. And this is supposed to hurt the economy of people like Britain, but instead it's only hurting the economy of the United States, which is definitely never a good idea, because in his first term, you're seeing he's doing all these things to increase to lower the debt, to increase the economy, and now this decision is taking many steps backwards, and it's really not a good look for him. So that's definitely not a good decision on his end. And he's really dealing with all these issues back to back to back, and they're all kind of feeding into each other. And although he does some positive things in his second term, they're overshadowed by the negative foreign affairs and foreign issues that are going on at this time. When we think pirates, we really don't place them in the 1800s. We think things like Pirates of the Caribbean, and we think that they're fictional, and there's really no way that they can make such an impact on history. We didn't even know that they had a place in history this late in history, but they did, and they had a huge impact on the second term of Thomas Jefferson, because they were very prevalent. They were raiding American merchant ships. They were taking goods from the American merchants. They were kind of ruining the economy at this point, because America was losing profits as a result of them taking these goods and forcing these people into slavery. Because after these Barbary pirates would take these American merchants off the water, the United States would really have to pay to get them back, and this would affect the economy in many different ways. So these people were based in the Mediterranean, and they didn't just torture these American ships, they also tortured other European ships and nations, and this has been an ongoing issue that finally Thomas Jefferson fixes. So we're going to see big events like the Philadelphia warship naval captain deciding to burn down this ship in order to prevent these pirates from raiding it. And when this happens, Jefferson decides that he's not going to pay tribute to get back these American merchants that were on this Philadelphia warship. And by doing this, he shows the Barbary pirates that he's no longer going to submit to their requests. So in the end, he installs all these blockades and these raids on the Barbary pirates. He attacks their land, which is kind of a new approach to this situation. And in the end, Jefferson pays a $60,000 ransom to get these Americans that were on the Philadelphia warship back. And as a result of this big payout, the Barbary pirates agree that they are going to stop the piracy. They're going to stop torturing American ships. And in the end, it seems like this was a huge military conflict, and it seems like this was a lot of, war that was going on between the United States and the Barbary pirates, but it wasn't a declared war. So when we look at the quasi-war, it's kind of the same thing. Congress did not declare a war, but they really gave the United States this military backing and this authorization to go ahead and use this military force to defend the United States merchants and the ships and the commerce that's going on in the ocean. So at the end of the day, Thomas Jefferson uses this ability to kind of use his military power, and he goes against these Barbary pirates, and he finally ends this ongoing conflict that's been going for way too long. Okay, so the Chesapeake versus Leopard affair was really a disaster in Thomas Jefferson's second term of presidency. So during this time period, you're seeing that France and Great Britain are in another conflict with each other. This seems to be the drama that never ends between these two nations. So England and France are now fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, and they're both mad that the United States doesn't want to be involved and help either side, because we know that the United States is having this neutrality pact. They don't want to get involved in anything with either of these nations, and British the British happened to be impressing American ships, forcing people to fight in their Royal Navy. And a lot of these people that were forced to fight in the Royal Navy, that were American citizens, end up escaping from the Royal Navy, coming back to the United States, or even just escaping from Britain in general and going to the United States to avoid being involved in this war. And now the British are sending out ships to find these deserters and bring them back to the Royal Navy and essentially punish them for even deserting in the first place. So the Chesapeake versus Leopard event is a really good example of how this whole situation went sour really fast. So on June 22nd, 1807, you're going to see James Barron, who was the captain of the Chesapeake, and Captain Humphreys, who is the captain of the Leopard, really go neck to neck, and bad things are going to come out of this. So on this day, the Leopard really essentially pulls up to the Chesapeake and says, you know, we're going to look in your ship, we're going to search it, and we're going to find all the deserters that are on your ship. And James Barron, who is the captain of the Chesapeake, obviously rejects this and says, no, absolutely not. You're not coming on this ship. And the Leopard opens fire and unloads on the Chesapeake, killing 3 on board and wounding 18. And at the end of this, the Chesapeake has to surrender, and they take 4 deserters with them on the Leopard. This is a huge loss for the United States and for Jefferson in his second presidency, because the United States after this is furious. They want war. They think this is cause for war. This was embarrassing to the United States. This is ridiculous. But Thomas Jefferson poured a lot of the military budget into the national debt. Like I said in the very beginning of this PowerPoint, he really shrinks the military, which does not give any room for the United States to go to war and defend themselves against British impressment and the way that the British attacked the Chesapeake. So this was really a huge low point for Thomas Jefferson in his second term of presidency. So as we can see, this whole conflict was really just a result of the anger that Britain had towards the people who were deserting the Royal Navy and trying to escape this Napoleonic War and go to the United States. So instead of giving the United States the war that they want against Britain, you're now seeing that Thomas Jefferson is going to put legislation in place, the Embargo Act of 1807, which he thinks is going to punish Great Britain and France for their actions, you know, the way they impress and torture American ships. But instead, it really backfires even more on, you know, his second presidency. So as we can see, the Chesapeake versus Leopard is a disaster in itself, and then what comes afterwards is even more of a disaster as well. Like I said in the previous slide, the Chesapeake versus Leopard event caused a lot of anger in the United States. A lot of people wanted a war, but Thomas Jefferson wanted to avoid war at all costs. So instead of going to war and using military strategies to devastate Britain, he instead uses economic strategies to devastate Britain. And he thinks that passing this Embargo Act of 1807 will devastate the British economy and have them basically running back to the United States, apologizing for what they've done and changing their ways. But that does not happen. So the Embargo Act was Thomas Jefferson's way of cutting off trade with every other nation, Britain being the center of that legislation. So he's thinking that by cutting off trade, no one can trade with us and we can't trade with anyone. We're going to devastate the British economy because the trade between the United States and Britain was a big one. But this is not the case. Instead of it devastating the British economy, it really devastates our economy because trading with foreign nations is such a big part of the money coming in to the United States. So basically, this was a huge fail. Thomas Jefferson did this to teach Britain a lesson, but instead it really just hurt our economy and ended up being another low point of his second term. So this slide is pretty self-explanatory, but it's really important to understand. I read something online that said that, Noah Webster is one of these forgotten founding fathers that people don't really mention when they talk about the beginnings of the United States. And it does kind of make sense because, we all know what a dictionary is today. It is, this set of words that really defined a culture and a nation of people, and that's what this essentially did. So in the early 1800s, you have Noah Webster, who created this American dictionary of the English language. It was the first time anything like this came out, and it really gave a set list of words that defined our culture and who we were as a nation. So it's been this theme in the 19th century that gradual abolition needed to start to be a topic of conversation. So as we talked about with New York during this time period, in 1799, New York is making these steps to gradually get rid of slavery, and it's not happening overnight. And this is exactly what this act prohibiting importation of slaves is doing. So when we look at Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, it reads, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person." So this is basically saying that, legislation went into effect, but it did not have to be fully carried out until the year 1808. So that really shows how this gradual abolition of slavery was happening. Nothing was set in stone and nothing was happening right away. Everything was happening kind of slowly with getting rid of slavery. So this finally fully went into effect on January 1st, 1808. And this really said that there was no new slaves that were allowed to be coming in and out of the U.S. So trading in and out of the U.S. With these slaves is not allowed anymore. But there's always a catch, because you were allowed to continue to trade within your state. You were allowed to trade across state lines. So the fact that you weren't allowed to trade in and out of the country was definitely a positive step towards the end of the slave trade, but you were still allowed to trade through the entirety of the inside of the U.S. So this is what we mean when we talk about this gradual abolition, because nothing was happening fully. Little steps were being made to finally get rid of slavery.